Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Along with Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech. We're going to get into a topic that we have been discussing for weeks on end now, and that is the challenge that those of us in the media have speaking to government officials. I think it started during COVID, where we've all had a challenge of being able to get one-on-one sit-downs, almost kind of confrontational interviews with government officials that we need to hold to account. Jonathan's running to an issue right now in Washington.
Yeah, it just happened to me yesterday. I was at a press conference with the governor of Washington State, Governor Inslee, the King County Executive Dow Constantine, State Senator Manka Dhingra was, supposed to speak, and so on and so forth, about a behavioral health care center that was opening. I RSVP'd to the event, however, and I got approved. I arrived to the event, and then another media handler from the city of Kirkland comes to me and says, I needed to go because I wasn't an invited guest, that I didn't have credentials. Of course, I showed my credentials multiple times. And, I can only imagine, where this was coming from, because, again, I got approval, RSVP to this event, and I show up and they want me to go. And the common denominator is Dow Constantine and Governor Inslee. They've both banned me from their press conferences in the past. And I think they were caught off guard to see me there, and they simply asked the local officials to get me out of there. But thankfully, Kirkland officials came to their senses, and, I stayed. But I'm dealing with this all the time now.
I think it's really common. I mean, last year, I had a chance to try to interview Mayor London Breed in San Francisco, and I was 4 feet from her. We were masked up. She was masked. We were outdoors. And then she said to me, COVID protocol, I can't do the interview. And she got whisked away. And this is commonplace increasingly, unless a politician thinks you're an ally, right? And this is true of every scenario, federal level, county level, state level, local level. They basically want to talk to folks on their side. And this is a huge issue that we're not just seeing here domestically. I just saw this clip that a young lady who works at CNN in China put up. And Selena Wang put this up. It's a very short clip, but basically the Chinese political leaders are walking away from any kind of confrontation, any kind of interview. We saw this in Sacramento a few weeks ago, where Rob Bonta, who is in charge of the Justice Department here in the state of California, he's the Attorney General. His wife Mia was initially given authority to look after his budget, the DOJ budget in California. She got confronted by a journalist in Sacramento. It took her a few days. Then she read a statement, and finally they pulled her from overseeing that budget. But increasingly, unless you're like in their face, they have no interest in actually talking to us.
Yeah, it's really about controlling the narrative. I mean, that's the bottom line. And at the end of the day, when reporters can't get in questions, or certain reporters get iced out because these reporters won't parrot certain talking points, then ultimately this hurts democracy, right? The folks, the citizens out there, they don't have access to information. They don't have access to different perspectives and worldviews. And you're not going to be able to make all the decisions. And it leads to bad policy in many cases. And we're seeing that a lot in Washington State. And I've been here in the Seattle area now for 3+ years. And I've started to ask, how do these laws, come to fruition? And now I'm starting to see that you have a passive base of voters, and at the same time residents. You also have a media that's not robust and holding public officials accountable. And right now you have PR teams for these politicians who are outgunning journalists. And that's what's happening right now. And I'm just one local independent journalist here in Seattle trying to make a difference. But I've made enough of a difference where I'm making noise, and they don't want me there. So I'm a threat to them.
Yeah, it used to be like 10-1 PR people versus journalists. I think it's probably like 20 to 25-1 now. It's incredible.
I was at the press conference yesterday. There were no reporters from any of the local TV stations, one local radio reporter and one local print reporter, and the independent journalist, the senior fellow here. And that's a total of 3 reporters, and none of us got to ask any questions.
Now, you did get a one-on-one with Inslee. How did you get that done, though?
So that's really interesting. So I finally did catch up with the governor. His media handlers know that I'm trying to chase him all the time. Look, I have a policy. I'll never go and interrupt a politician if, they're having a meal with family. I rarely will ever knock on their door unless they're accused of murder or something like that, or malfeasance. But the governor, if he's out in the public, he's fair game. And my sources on the ground told me he was at a a school, talking to parents, frustrated parents who are about to protest, a homeless encampment that's just spiraling out of control right across the street from the John Stanford International School in Seattle's Wallingford neighborhood. So that was my time to confront him. And, to the governor's credit, he graciously answered a couple questions. But when I started pressing him on some harder ones, he walked away and took off in his SUV. So that's just kind of part of the course for, working with the politicians and elected officials in the state. It's like this game of cat and mouse. And like you said earlier, if you're on their side, or at least perceived to be on their side, they'll talk to you, they'll invite you in. But if again, depends, of course, on the political leader, and it's not everyone. Let me be very clear. I mean, I've definitely had access in the past year to a lot of other local officials in Washington state who've been extremely welcoming and have answered my tough questions and have welcomed that as well and thanked me for at least shining a light, at least covering the community. So it really depends. But, that's what it's come down to now. It's going to be a handful of reporters really chasing the big story.
It's true. And it's not just one party. It's both parties doing this. It's across the board. And I will say this, the best politicians that I've encountered, the ones who've had the most success, are the ones who are actually willing to level with you and talk to you either on deep background, off the record, or in front of a camera. I know I had this conversation with Governor Jerry Brown years ago. Gave me 30 minutes, no issue, no handlers, straight shooter. And that's why he was so successul politically.
Yeah, and in this day and age of cell phones and video, I mean, it's the optics. It just looks horrible. The PR handlers need to, go back to, PR 101 and be reminded that, hey, if you're saying no comment or just walking away, it makes your, candidate look horrible.
It's true. Speaking of Washington State, again, you have another issue involving some of the policies going on in King County.
Yeah, this one's pretty absurd. King County Metro bus drivers, especially, working the downtown core, I think most of our viewers at this point know we have a drug addiction crisis exploding on the streets, especially fentanyl. And it's a free-for-all. You have drug addicts, riding the buses day in, day out. I mean, the running joke is that it's a mobile homeless shelter now. So they're doing fentanyl, heroin in open air, plain sight. And these secondhand fentanyl fumes are making the bus drivers sick. The bus drivers are going to their union, to the county, complaining. But here's the kicker. The county health officials are saying that fentanyl smoke is not a problem. It's absolutely insane.
I mean, this is where I wonder where the data is coming from, because I think we know with secondhand smoke, in terms of cigarette smoke, that's been proven to cause damage to people, proven to have long-lasting health effects. And as I recall, cigarette smoke, 50, 75 years ago, they said there was no issue with cigarettes, right? It wasn't going to affect people's health.
Yeah, and exactly, because there's a lobby behind it. And, look, at the end of the day, I don't know who these doctors are. I'm not going to call him a quack, but, I'm reading from Dr. Scott Phillips. He's the medical director of the Washington Poison Center. And he says exposure to smoke from fentanyl presents, quote, no real risk. He goes on to say when someone smokes fentanyl, most of the drug has been filtered out by the user before there is secondhand smoke. It doesn't just sort of float around. There's no real risk to the everyday person being exposed to secondhand opioid smoke. I don't believe that. Second of all, doctor, would you want to be around fentanyl smokers sitting in a bus? I challenge this doctor to sit in a King County Metro bus next to fentanyl smokers. I think if it comes down to that, I think he'd be singing a different tune.
I mean, most of us are trying to avoid, this kind of scenario. So, I mean, you're honestly in the middle of it. I've seen you out there with a N95 mask on. I mean, what when you're wearing a mask and you're 2 feet from someone consuming this substance, what are you consuming? What are you smelling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some folks who see my videos online, I post it with, the 2-shot, and people are like, why are you still wearing a mask? I mean, obviously masks are associated with, COVID and so on and so forth, and the anti-maskers, blah, 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 blah. I wear the mask on the streets when I go to downtown Seattle because, number one, I don't want to be recognized by Antifa, these far-left activists who continue to target me. At this point, they all know who I am. But, like you said, the main reason is I don't want to be breathing in the fentanyl fumes. I'm around this every single day. Go to downtown Seattle right now, 3rd and Pine, 3rd and Pike, the main tourist corridor. You're going to see people doing all kinds of drugs in plain sight. They don't care. They're just looking for their high. And you just see these poor people, the the folks trying to get on the bus, get to work, get home, just dodging like the gauntlet of addicts who are just, again, throwing needles on the ground, foil on the ground. I mean, it's everywhere. It's like leaves on the ground of just fentanyl foil. It's out of control. So these public officials, I mean, at the end of the day, they're sounding just like academics. They need to come out here to the front lines to see what it's really like, and I think they'd have a different perspective.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear this, and I don't know if this is something that's specific to King County or have other health directors deduced that there's no issue with secondhand smoke when it comes to fentanyl.
Yeah, I mean, look, I haven't looked into the science, quite frankly, myself. I'm not going to say I'm a doctor, but at the end of the day, I'm going to err on the side of caution and avoid fentanyl smoke at all costs. I think it's problematic. What do you think? Are you going to be around a fentanyl smoker? You want us to take
Look,
that in?
look,
You want
I
to
mean,
put that around your kids?
I covered a chemical fire, maybe 15 years ago in Salinas, and you want to be some heroic reporter, get the shot of the flames, get the shot of the building going down. You got within 50 feet of that building, and you could feel the chemicals entering your system. And I was like, let's get the heck out of here. It's not worth it. And so that these were, that was a chemical fire. I just, these are chemicals. These are processed materials. I'm still stunned that people are so cavalier with their health, because you damage your lungs. You're not getting that back. It's really hard to fix damaged lungs. I don't know where these folks are getting data. Maybe they're not using data, and maybe that's the issue.
Yeah, and I've broke a story on this show several weeks ago about the fentanyl in the walls of these motels being purchased by King County to house the homeless. They're in many cases total losses. So if the fentanyl in the walls, prevent an entire facility to be used, what about fentanyl smoke all adding up? Isn't it kind of the same source? I mean, again, I'm not a science major or a doctor, but to me, I'm gonna use common sense here and say fentanyl smoke is bad. Avoid it. It's harmful.
Well, I think it's solid advice there. I wouldn't advise anyone to be hanging out in those corridors. Now we're going to move on to another issue flaring up in Washington, really another war of words. We've covered these kind of topics before. This one involving two members of Congress. Obviously, the right and the left go back and forth with their invective, but this is something that we've also brought up before. Congresswoman Judy Chu has been challenged. Her loyalty has been challenged by another member of Congress, Congressman Gooden out of Texas, who's a Republican. Basically, Chu was her loyalty has been questioned because she did not support an effort to pass something against the Chinese Communist Party. There's obviously a huge movement over the last couple of years that we've seen. It initially was a Republican-led movement against the CCP, but we're seeing Democrats now push back against the CCP. And I see this with the FCC, for example, where former chairman Ajit Pai put in a policy that got now adopted by Jessica Rosenworcel, who's a Democrat. So we're seeing consensus throughout the federal government. But in this case, Chu took this very personal, and she thought this attack was xenophobic because she didn't want to support this resolution. Gooden questioned her loyalty, and he's been denounced by many other members of Congress. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because I know both as Asian American men, we understand that there's been kind of this dual loyalty question posed to people like us historically.
Yeah, and just for the record, Gooden is a white male, and that doesn't help his cause. But at the same time, I think he has every right to ask that question, and I think it's a legitimate question. It just happens to be, Chu is a Chinese American, and right away, I get it. When you're dealing with discrimination your whole life, you're called all kinds of racial slurs. I think your immediate response is a defensive posture when someone maybe questions your Americanness or your loyalty to this nation. I get that as well. But I think when we're in the situation where there's a arms race going on, literally a race to be a world power now, and China, clearly showing its dominance and flexing, I think just Chu happens to be Asian American. But I think that question, I don't know what's inside this man's heart and mind at the end of the day, but it's a legitimate question. It can be raised to anyone. And I think Chu is just, again, overreacting in this case.
And this issue is being tied also with like property rights, right? Because in recent years, it's been discovered that there's been a lot of real estate purchases, especially agricultural land in places like North Dakota, in places like Texas, where you have Chinese investors, Chinese nationals buying land in the United States. And of course, our government has no issue with just about anybody investing their capital in this country. In fact, you can get a visa. You spend X amount of money, you can come to this country legally if you have that kind of capital. But I think now there's a pushback, right? Because do we want to have our agricultural resources, controlled by folks from another government? And we are effectively, if they don't want to say it, but it does seem like we're in a bit of a Cold War with China. And so this is where we have this pushback, because here we are, we're both Asian Americans. We grew up around Asian Americans. I never really saw any disloyalty amongst, Asian Americans, folks that are born and raised here in this country. They've, to my knowledge, always been very loyal to the red, white, and blue. But because of this issue, and again, this goes back to the internment camps that the Japanese Americans faced, in our lifetime, or in some people's lifetimes, like Congressman Mike Honda had to deal with as a child. I mean, it's kind of stunning that these things are popping back up.
Yeah, and at the same time, though, I've experienced discrimination and racism and dealt with all kinds of stereotypes for being Asian American. I mean, people call me Chinese, and I'm Korean American. People call me a communist, and I'm not. I mean, I love America. I was born here. I was born in Fairfax, Virginia. Yet at the same time, I think we're living during a time where we have to, at the very least, scrutinize, each case on an individual basis. Yeah, I have a lot of Chinese American friends. They hate communism. They hate CCP China. But guess what? They're also Chinese nationals who have come here in the past few years who are literally spies, who have infiltrated our academic institutions, our business institutions, our tech and science institutions. And they have been convicted of stealing IP, intellectual property, to bring back to China. So this is ongoing, and it's a real damn shame that, again, Asian Americans, especially Chinese, are facing this, because I know a Chinese American friend. He's a Chinese, well, he's a Chinese national, but he's wondering now. He's part of this protest in Texas recently, where they're fighting for their rights now to buy land. He's like, I just want to buy a house, but his association with China at one point, how does that get all sorted out? So it's a real shame it's come down to this, but at the same time, I still believe that national security also needs to be a priority. And we have to scrutinize what's going on with China and their motives. China right now is a hostile nation. They are our enemy, okay? I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the communist government and the policies. And that distinction clearly needs to be made. And unfortunately, we always use broad brushstrokes and paint people into one category. You're from China, you're CCP in conversation. But we really have to scrutinize this. And I don't think it's racist to ask questions like that of Choe, especially from a non-Asian person. I think it's totally okay.
And this is the issue we have, because for the last 50 years, America and China have this kind of most favored nation status, right? We were doing aggressive business with China. We've had this huge influx of folks from Asia, from China, from India in particular. But now all of a sudden things have changed, because China is on the rise. They are spending money on defense. And I should mention, all these countries are spending, there's like $1 trillion of spending towards defense. This is true of India, true of China, Japan, the United States. Everybody's spending. Everybody's on edge. Our next story is going to be about the G20. These guys aren't getting along, and it's because of these alliances, Russia and China. You've got the Ukraine situation, the U.S. and the Quad. This is why things are so tense. And so now it's boiling down to these local issues, whether a Chinese national can buy a piece of land. And I think it's certainly going to have far-reaching implications. I mean, we talked about, whether President Trump, triggered more xenophobia towards Asian Americans. Again, there's a lot of data saying that Asian Americans have been targeted, but was it all, by President Trump? It's hard to put it all on one man, but certainly
there isn't one definitive study that says that. Yeah, I think Trump had something to do with it. I think he could have used better language. I wish he didn't keep calling it the China virus the way he did, and he emphasizing China, China, China. But when it comes down to the facts, and now the lab leak theory being, accepted more by even law enforcement and agencies here in America, the FBI and so on and so forth, looking into this now, we have to, again, we can't just use broad brushstrokes. It's so easy to point fingers and say this person is the reason, or that's the boogeyman, and so on and so forth. But we've got to look at each case, on an individual basis, in my opinion, and we just can't be using broad brushstrokes like this, because we further inflame, again, the racism and the xenophobia.
Let's get into the G20 now. It took place in India. India has the presidency of the G20. These are the 20 most powerful nations on the planet. And so they all got together in New Delhi and met with the prime minister, of course, Prime Minister Modi. They met with the foreign minister, Jai Shankar, and we had Anthony Blinken there from the United States, the full quad. Russia showed up. It was an interesting dichotomy. These folks, the last couple of years, because of the Ukraine situation, are not getting along. And they oftentimes want to have at least a resolute front that, hey, all these nations are on the same page, but they're clearly not. And I think what's interesting about what's going on and why I want to bring this up is, India is kind of positioning themselves as the one nation that's trying to get along with everybody. For folks who aren't aware, India's had a long-standing relationship with Russia. They've had a long-standing relationship with Iran. These are nations that currently are in conflict with the United States. And meanwhile, the US, India have a strong defense alliance. You add that with Japan, you add that to Australia, you have the UK involved, France. These countries are working together on defense cooperation, namely to counter China. And meanwhile, Russia and China have an alliance. And I think this is where these topics come in, where you see what's going on the global battlefield, and it boils down to what's happening here at the local level as well.
Well, this is a topic I think the rest of, America especially, and, is not too familiar with. And I'm listening to this and I'm just getting caught up to speed as well. But I think India has a point. At the end of the day, I think what India is trying to say right now is enough with this white Western European narrative that has been continued to be pushed on our country. India is an emerging superpower. Okay, it's the largest democracy in the world. They have decided at this point they're willing to go off on their own if they have to and align with countries that ultimately support India. Okay, and that's just kind of the reality right now. And I think the rest of the world is finally seeing the rise of India here, and they're on notice.
Yeah, I mean, the dichotomy is fascinating because S. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister for India, I think has used the most kind of strong language that I've seen of any Indian diplomat. If you interface with Indian government officials as we have, through our reporting, virtually all of them are very affable, kind, genial people. They try not to say one syllable out of place. That's like the typical Indian diplomat trying to get along with everybody. But Jai Shankar's made some very pointed remarks about how he thinks India is the center of the world, which he was kind of being jocular there. But at the same time, it shows a change in approach. Like, hey, India is the country that's growing. India's on the rise. You do want to and need to work with us. And of course, I think America, from an American standpoint, it shows that America's not quite doesn't quite have the footing it once had, right? Because we've had these conflicts in the Middle East that have gone awry. We've had all of these issues for decades, intervening in foreign territory. And I think these countries now are advanced enough. There's enough communication out there where they're like, hey, we don't have to listen to America. America can't just give us a few $1 billion to shut up any longer. We have an economy and we have a population that's on the rise, and you got to work with us.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the case moving forward. And I think America's clearly lost its luster when it comes to the rest of the world.
Well, we're going to monitor this because I know Jai Shankar and Blinken are working on a lot of different initiatives between the U.S. and India. And that's why I wanted to bring that to your attention because, India generally was able to get consensus, and no consensus came about during the G20. And some people think that India looks bad because of that. But the Ukraine situation continues to be a huge sticking point, and it's something we'll continue to monitor. And of course, America continues to invest in this conflict. America spent billions of dollars, and this is just after we pulled out of Afghanistan. So
well, let's get to our guest, man, and let's see what she has to say, man.
Absolutely. Well, we're gonna turn to a different direction altogether. We're going to bring on now Manju Kulkarni, who is the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. Manju's been on the front lines of what we've been discussing on this show. We were very fortunate to receive a stipend from the state of California to talk about Asian American hate crimes. And I know Manju and her group, her coalition, has been at the forefront of keeping track of all this. So Manju, I really appreciate you coming on and hanging out with us as we try to break down these very convoluted, complicated issues, because there are some foreign dynamics, there are local dynamics. Give people your perspective, since you're consuming all this data that folks like us have to digest afterwards.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And Our organization, Stop AAPI Hate, was created in March of 2020, so just 3 years ago, to monitor and analyze what we saw as the emergence of anti-Asian hate. Since that time, we've received over 11,000 incident reports from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And I think what it tells us is that, while our community has been long ignored, that in fact, we have been, unfortunately, the recipients of much hate and discrimination, some of it fueled by racist rhetoric, which you both mentioned in the earlier segment. And now we are seeing once again policies that are also discriminatory against our communities.
So Manju, when you're seeing this on the front lines, I mean, there's been some funding issued by the state of California to help kind of Asian Americans, rise up, right? There was about $150 million allocation for the first time. Has that made a difference? I think that's important to note now that you've been in the trenches for a couple of years doing this. Obviously, we saw a rise of hate crimes during COVID. Has this kind of investment made an impact?
Absolutely. So, funds went, to a number of different organizations across the state. My local organization, AAPI Equity Alliance, is the regional lead for a project. Really, the funding in LA that goes to 24 organizations. There are many others across the state, and it's investments that are necessary to address the hate that communities are experiencing, whether they be Chinese American, Korean, Thai, South Asian, Japanese, Filipino. We know that anti-Asian hate impacts all AAPI groups, even including Pacific Islanders. And so what those funds do is allow direct services for community members, victims who've been impacted by hate, violence, and discrimination. It also goes toward prevention efforts. And so I think this funding is critical, and we hope that it'll continue moving forward, because we're already starting to see ways in which it is really provided the help and support our communities need.
Manju, as journalists, what we've been doing just the past few years, Stop AAPI Hate has been a tremendous resource, right? It's a place where a lot of journalists have been going. It's been the one-stop shop to get data, the latest, trends, and so on and so forth. I've actually referenced Stop AAPI Hate several times in a few of my stories. With that said, though, I know you guys aren't partisan, right? At the same time, how do you deal with critics who say that you guys lean liberal, you lean left?
I mean, the data is the data. So I guess I would need to know more in terms of where those accusations come from, what that's based on. I think that what we do is certainly the organizations that make up Stop AAPI Hate have been working in our communities for, combined 100 years. And so I think we know and understand the needs of the community, and we are able to put what we're seeing in context. So, for example, you mentioned in the last segment what we see as a reemergence of the alien land laws. So these are laws that in the 20th century prevented immigrants from owning property and literally stole rightfully owned property from thousands of Asian Americans in California and 13 other states. And that's what we're seeing now again. The Texas law, some of the other, the Texas bill, and other bills that have been introduced in the Georgia, Virginia, Montana legislatures. What I'd like to see is what is the evidence that individuals who are not U.S. citizens are buying property for nefarious purposes. My own parents were immigrants who bought property when we lived in the United States as when I was a child, and there was nothing illegal, there was nothing inappropriate about that, right? So why are we now causing suspicion on individuals who happen to be Chinese nationals whose children are U.S. citizens just simply because their race or ethnicity. What is the evidence that they have done anything wrong or they plan to do anything wrong other than raise their children, contribute to our economy, to our businesses, our academic institutions, hospitals? Without any evidence, I see no reason for such laws. And I think it's really back to the scapegoating that our data shows is happening all across our country.
Well, speaking of data, Manju, what I was going to ask you about is, and on this show, we basically say out loud what everyone's thinking. And it's so important you bring up this point because, the data is the data. But at the end of the day, and I think this is where a lot of journalists in the mainstream media fail, is it's to synthesize the data, contextualize the data. What does it mean for each community? And one of the issues that, again, that is discussed about among Asian Americans on all sides of the aisle is the raw reality that so many of these videos that have emerged over the past few years are Black or brown perpetrators beating the heck out of an Asian grandma or grandpa. Yet, at least on your website and on others, I just haven't seen at least on the mainstream, a real analysis of this. Why are we seeing so many, people of color, Black and brown folks beating up on Asian Americans? And why aren't we talking more about this?
Well, let me say this. First off, we don't collect perpetrator data, but I can tell you that researchers at University of Michigan and Maryland have done a number of studies, and we also have hate crimes reports from cities like LA and others that show actually most perpetrators are not African American. So what I think is happening is that often mainstream media and social media highlights those incidents that have Black perpetrators. And in fact, that is how white supremacy works, right? Where all of us feed into ideas of African Americans being criminals, that Asians are suspect and not to be trusted, that they're perpetual foreigners, that Latinx community members are, illegal immigrants. I mean, this is all part of white supremacy. And so that is why I posit that we see more depictions of African Americans. When we look at who has killed more Asian Americans in terms of these crimes, the Atlanta shooter was a white supremacist, right? He was not from the African American community. The individual who killed Sikh Americans in Indianapolis was a white supremacist. So what happened in Oak Creek, Wisconsin 10 years ago was perpetrated by a white supremacist. So what are the most horrific crimes were actually committed by individuals who are not only white, but actually believe in white nationalism and white supremacy.
No, that's a good point. What I'd like to see, though, and like you said, there is no actual data about the perpetrators. I'm just wondering why and who's willing to do that and be courageous enough to touch that, because these are the conversations that I'm having in the Asian American community. Everyone's afraid to say it out loud that, oh my gosh, it's another Black person beating up an Asian grandma, because they don't want to get canceled in this culture. All I'm saying, let's talk more about that. How did we get to this point? Because even my Black friends are saying, yes, it's happening. We see it. These people are idiots. My people are beating the hell out of your people, and it's a bad look for us. Yet we leave the conversation there. We try to explain it into different directions, and I just want to see some data, and I'm hoping maybe you guys will look into that. Is there a reason why you guys aren't looking into the perpetrators right now?
I mean, we have not collected that data from the beginning. I think when we look at policies, right, and policy solutions, which is much of what our work involves. And in fact, we had two bills in the California legislature that passed last year and were signed by the governor. We have a new bill this year relating to public transit and funding for surveys that help us understand how to make communities safer. That when you look at policy solutions, then race doesn't matter, right? Because the policy solutions that we have are about what we need to do moving forward to make all of our communities feel safer. But there are a number of public institutions that collect that data. As I mentioned, the LA County Human Relations Commission has done, they issue a hate crimes report every single year, and they've never found that a majority of perpetrators are African American. So the data that we have shows that that's simply not true.
Manju, getting to something that was very traumatic for Asian Americans were the shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. I mean, those were Asian American shooters that maimed and killed so many people in the state of California, which is a super diverse state. I mean, what kind of impact has this COVID pandemic have had on these communities of color? Has mental illness been looked into? I'm really trying to get to the root causes of why we're having such disconnects. I mean, Jonathan brings up a strong point in the sense that we are connected now through these social devices, right? You have your cell phone on you, and you see the scourge going on, right? We see incidences, whether they're in Florida or in Washington or even around the world, where we're seeing these hyper local episodes that are now inflamed across the globe. And it's something that happens in India today or in China. We actually get it within moments through social media. And I think there's been all these different episodes that folks have been going through the last couple of years. I mean, have you been able to peel back the layers about, why in particular Asian Americans, and I'm sure there's other communities that feel targeted too, but just to talk about Asian Americans specifically, have you been able to peel back where this is coming from?
Well, certainly when we look at Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, what's the commonality there? Easy access to guns, right? No other country in the world has a type of gun violence and the levels that we have. We've already had 100 mass shootings in the United States in just 2023 in less than 100 days. And so I think that Asian Americans, like other Americans, have easy access to what are weapons of war, assault weapons, AR-15s, others that can kill many people in just a few seconds or minutes. And that's what we had in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. So I think, every nation in the world has individuals with mental health problems and individuals who've experienced personal trauma, but they don't have the level of killings that we have in the United States. So I think that's what we really need to look at. I understand that President Biden is coming to Monterey Park next week to speak about gun violence and the fact that we don't have laws that prohibit assault weapons, right? We're not talking about personal safety. We're talking about killing many, many people within short amounts of time. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had. And when we look at AAPI data, they found that a strong majority of individuals in the AAPI community support sensible gun safety measures. And so I think that's really where the conversation needs to go.
Manju, despite maybe some of our differences or the way we see the data, differently, I know that we all want to make sure that this topic, stop AAPI hate, continues to be out there in the narrative, right? Especially in the mainstream media, because it's not. What are your thoughts on the way the mainstream media's covered it initially and where it's at now? And especially here in Seattle, I can tell you, I'm a big fan of Mayor Bruce Harrell, but when there was a budget deficit in the city this past year, the first place he went to cut was the AAPI hate budget. And we're seeing this across the nation. So what are your thoughts on the role of the mainstream media and how do you keep this important story going? Because unfortunately, it keeps happening. I don't want you to have a job. I want Stop AAPI Hate to go away if at all possible. I'd love for you to move on, but it has to be here. And you guys are doing good work. So I know that was a mouthful, but what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, thank you for your kind words. And we did issue a statement regarding the mayor's actions in Seattle. We think that there need to continue to be, resources put in to our communities, just as we have in the state of California with what Ravi spoke about earlier, which is investments in our communities, in our community-based organizations. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is much of our work started with COVID-19, but you see that scapegoating, right? That involves not just public health, but also economic anxiety and national security. And if I may talk a little bit about, what we are seeing, even in terms of the public and the mainstream media's response, which is, Congresswoman Judy Chu was scapegoated essentially in terms of her support for Dominic Ng, someone that President Biden had nominated to a important position related to our financial systems, and I think it was that Congressman Gooden was critiquing is a nomination of a Chinese American just because he was Chinese, and saying that Judy Chu was also to be questioned, right? Simply because she's Chinese American, despite the fact that she was born and raised in the United States, has spent all of her life in California and in Washington. So this is the next level of what we're seeing, is that racist rhetoric is being weaponized even on folks in the halls of Congress, as well as on each and every one of us. And it's leading back to the policies like alien land laws that prevent us from living and thriving in the United States simply, again, because of our racial background.
Well, before we let you go, Manju, I want to leave you on this. I mean, we are seeing all kinds of these kind of micro issues that are bubbling to the surface here in the United States. That's part of the reason we did this show is, whether it's AAPI hate crimes or, for that matter, we've been talking about caste on this show. And there's all these different discrimination laws, and it's caused all kinds of stuff where people are irate at why a micro minority like the Indian community or the Hindu community feels targeted. What can be done? Because we have this giant coalition throughout this country, 50 states, virtually all of us come from different backgrounds. We have different points of views. What can we do to get people to get along better? Because certainly we see the division that's taking place here. And I know you have you're one cog trying to focus in on the Asian American experience, but certainly Hispanics have challenges, African Americans have challenges, the broader framework. And of course, when we look at white America, there's a lot of folks that feel left behind. So, as a thought leader in this space, what do you think we have to do to get this country more united and not just working on these wedge issues?
Right. I think that's a great question. And, let me paraphrase something that was said by a former white supremacist, white nationalist, who was invited to the White House for a United Against Hate event that I happened to attend. When he was asked by reporter Lisa Ling about what needs to be done to prevent hate, right? What needs to be done so that our communities get along? His answer was so interesting. He said, we need strong public education. We need affordable housing. We need safe streets. We need less gun violence. So he didn't talk about Band-Aid measures. He didn't talk about, people coming together and singing Kumbaya. He talked about the things that government is good at when it actually tackles these issues, which is the needs of everyday citizens. When they don't have their needs met, they then can succumb to the racializing and weaponizing of racist rhetoric, which unfortunately a lot of our politicians do very well, right? Rather than solving the problems of everyday community members, what they do is blame immigrants, they blame Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinx community members for their woes, rather than investing in those communities, rather than trying to provide strong public schools, housing that people can afford, good, solid jobs with a living wage. So these, to me, are the solutions that we need. And I think that will drive down hate, not simply engaging in rhetorical conversations sort of over and over again.
Manju, I want to get in one last quick question, and before I kick it over to Ravi, but he was bringing up the point about sort of this movement in this country to bring up all these caste discrimination bills, right? And it's really impacting the South Asian community. And here in Seattle, just in the past few weeks, Council Member Shama Sawant, who's Indian American, introduced a caste discrimination bill, and it passed with flying colors. Yet at the same time, I think a lot of these council members really don't know what these are about, and they're just kind of rubber stamping these. So from kind of Stop AAPI's, standpoint, it's almost like there's like a civil war going on in the South Asian community based on class or caste or religion. How are you guys kind of sorting all of that out? And where do you guys stand on this?
Right. Well, I will say, and thank you for that question. We have not issued a statement directly about caste discrimination, coming from the South Asian community. I think it is very real. And I think that, what you've often seen is individuals at, these large tech companies who do discriminate against lower caste staff members. And so I think, if we are truly to fight discrimination in our communities, we have to do that not just when outsiders or those in another racial group discriminate against us, but even when those within our own communities discriminate. So I think those are very positive policies, and I'm certainly on a personal level in support of more of those being passed across our nation.
Well, Manju, we really appreciate your time. I know that is a consistent debate that we're going to have on this show, because obviously there's folks that are on both sides on that particular issue. But I thank you so much for all the work you do, all the data that you folks provide at Stop AAPI Hate. Manju Kulkarni, co-founder of Stop AAPI, thanks for dropping by.
We need you back. We really do.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
And before we wrap up the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to a guy that I worked with when I was at Syracuse as an undergrad, Jim Boeheim. He finally has stepped down as head coach after 47 years. The reason I bring up Jim Boeheim, not because his coaching prowess, it's well documented, second most wins of all time in college basketball, but that guy got journalist trained, believe it or not, Jonathan. I don't know if you've had a chance to interact with him, but for those of us that went into sports broadcasting, which I started off doing at Syracuse and continue to do on occasion here in my role, Jim Boeheim was so prickly, he actually made you stand up straight and articulate a question. And if you basically got out of line, asked a silly question, he would come at you. And he got you prepared for the real world. So I want to give a shout out to Jim Boeheim for actually getting journalists prepared for the real world. He wasn't some affable guy that you can go buddy with. He gave it to you straight, and if you didn't come with it, he was gonna really tear you up in front of everyone. So shout out to Jim Boeheim. Congrats on a heck of a career, 47 years at Syracuse as a head coach, and like 60 years of his life there representing that school, my alma mater. So for Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We'll see you next time.